Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a new weekly podcast shining a spotlight on Australian fiction. My name is Claudine Tinellis. As a writer and avid reader, I love chatting about books. And in this podcast, I'll chat to authors, publishers and readers, giving you, dear listener, insight into what's hot on the Australian fiction scene. So if you're looking for your next book recommendation or just want to know more about Aussie fiction writers, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and enjoy. Today on the podcast, listeners, I'm excited to be welcoming back another one of my favourite authors. Barbara Hannay is an international best-selling Australian author with over 50 titles to her name and over 12 million books sold globally. Barbara is a force to be reckoned with. Her new book, The Garden of Hopes and Dreams, published by Penguin, was released in early August. A delightfully heartwarming book about the importance of community and connection that I absolutely adored. So I'm delighted to welcome Barbara back to the podcast today. Hi, Barbara.
Hi, Claudine. Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
Oh, thank you. It's lovely to be speaking with you again. And I can't believe, as I was saying just before we started recording, that it was just over 2 years ago now that I first spoke to you. Doesn't time fly?
Oh, it certainly does. And the older you get, the faster it goes.
Oh, yeah, I would agree with that. Absolutely. So, Barbara, tell me about your new book and what inspired you to write it.
Okay. Well, it's about a community garden, essentially. But when I originally got the idea, I wanted the idea of people who were lost in some way, who started working on this community garden and got to know each other and felt connected. And originally I was going to have it in a little country town somewhere, as I've written many of my stories. But we moved from the Atherton Tablelands back to Townsville during that time, and I was missing my country garden a lot. I had also at one point in my life lived in an apartment block, and I always used to wish at that time that the tennis court on the roof could be turned into a garden. So I put all those, my own hopes and dreams and fantasies into the story and wrote about people in an apartment block who create a rooftop garden. And I enjoyed exploring all the different people in the apartments and how quite often people in apartments don't know each other very well at all. Because that was something I had experienced. And I had discovered for myself how getting together for a barbecue on the roof or whatever, really opens that line of connection. So probably among all the books I've written, this is one that's been closest to my own lived experience in some ways.
As I started to say to you just before we started recording, I found the premise of this book so compelling on many levels, not the least of which is the fact that the arrival of COVID has highlighted our very basic need for human connection. Certainly here in the southern states in Australia, where COVID has had a bigger impact on Australians, we are seeing the terrible psychological impact of separation from families and friends, kids who are unable to go to school, families unable to gather. Was this something you wanted to consciously explore in this novel?
Interestingly, I started writing this before we realised we had a pandemic on our hands. I started it probably February, January last year. But during that time, I read a book by Johann Hari called Lost Connections. And it's actually looking at depression, which I'm grateful that I don't suffer from, but I know a lot of people who do. Mm-hmm. And I often look for interesting ways of exploring character as well. And his theory in this book was that a lot of depression comes from loss of connection. He wrote this way before the pandemic. So it was almost kind of prescient that I just came across this sort of line of thinking. And then as I was writing and the pandemic closed in around us, because we were even locked down up here for a while, it reinforced that was an important way to explore. But no, it wasn't COVID that inspired the original idea.
Gardening and nature are obviously central themes in this novel, and Vera certainly does throw herself into her gardening when she moves to the Australian outback from England as a young bride. And I think it's fair to say that gardening is something that she retreats to in times of difficulty. What is it about gardening, and hearing that you are also an avid gardener, what is it about gardening do you think that makes it so therapeutic?
I think just being out in the fresh air is the first step. Because I'm a writer, I spend a lot of time locked away in my study and just stepping outside is the first step. And you just think, I really should be out here more often. There's the physical exercise of gardening that you get without having to, be really conscious about doing it. It's just that you're doing it because it's required, digging and walking and lugging and lifting and all those sorts of things. And then there's the results, watching these beautiful things grow, getting butterflies and insects and birds coming closer to the house because of the blossoms or whatever you have around you, especially if you grow Australian natives, which I love. I have to admit, it's also in my genes. My parents were very keen gardeners. I remember my grandmother, her garden. Most of my parents' friends, if we went to visit, it always involved a walk around the garden and talking, So it's part of my mindset as well. Yeah. But I did read recently an article where actually getting your hands dirty, the actual bacteria that you get on your hands, they've discovered is really good. There's the whole gut thing is the big thing with health these days, and your microbiome or whatever it is. Well, they've discovered that getting your hands dirty is actually really good for your health too, on a bacterial level, which I'd never thought about.
Well, I certainly hadn't either, but it kind of makes sense in a way.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So, Barb, tell me about the pink philodendron that scores a starring role in this book.
Yes. Maddie buys one of these at the very beginning of the book on the day that she discovers that her boyfriend's cheating on her. And she had been buying it to impress him because it's a beautiful plant. It has lush green leaves, but also bright sections of pink. I can't show you. I've got some here. But and why it was important to me is my dad gave me a piece, probably 30 years ago. He's been dead for 25 years now, so it was well over, around the 30, I don't know, even longer, I suppose, that he had growing in his garden. And I've kept it in pots and baskets and in the ground, wherever, and I've lived in a few different places in the time since then, and I've still got it in a pot and a basket here. So it's got huge sentimental, but it's also quite rare now. I don't see it in nurseries at all. So it was just special. So in the story, I use it a bit symbolically towards the end as well, again. So that was another little personal connection in that story.
Well, I have to say I didn't know what it looked like, and I had to Google it as I was reading it. And I don't think I've ever seen it here. I don't know that it's necessary. Is it more of a Northern Australian
I'd
plant?
say so. I'd say it's a tropical, probably came from South America or somewhere like that.
Barbara, this book was set in Brisbane, and for both Vera and Maddie, it was a definite contrast to their country origins. Quite possibly, Brisbane is an underrated setting for an Australian novel. So I wanted to ask you, was it deliberate for you to set it in Brisbane?
Yeah, well, yes, because I wanted a rooftop garden in an apartment block, I didn't think it would work so well in Northern Australia where the roofs are so very hot. But I grew up in Brisbane. I went to school and university there, and I have two daughters who live there now, so I visit regularly, and I usually get to go on the River Cat and do some of those things that I wrote about in the book. I love Brisbane. In fact, when I first left home, all I wanted to do eventually, I started teaching and moving around the state with teaching. I hoped to get back, but I never have got back there to live, and I probably don't want to go back to live anymore, but it's another form of home for me. So I was very happy to write about it.
Okay, so one of the themes that you address quite poignantly, I thought, in this book is the notion that everyone is battling something in their lives, some secret pain or grief perhaps. This was certainly true of the residents of the Riverview apartment block that Vera and Maddie live in. So often I think that in the social media age that we're living in now, we can forget that, what we see on someone's Instagram page or on their Facebook page, and dare I say it, on dating apps, might be a front or a manufactured image to show ourselves in the best possible light, and that what we see isn't always the truth. Why was this important for you to explore in this novel?
Good question. I don't know that I was consciously exploring the fact that we hide the truth, but I certainly was looking to have people who were lost in some way or, unhappy in some aspect of their lives who come together and as a result share these things that they may not have shared under any other circumstances. I agree with you now that social media has made us all put on this sort of bright, happy exterior. Absolutely. I think it's true that everyone has got some kind of hurt or disappointment in their lives that they don't talk about very often because it's not socially acceptable or they're trying to keep up a particular image. And sometimes these are bigger than others. For some people they're more drastic or hurtful. It was just something that fascinated me. If you're writing a story, you need to have problems to solve. Yeah.
I found that a really fascinating thing. And, often people are hiding their real selves from other people. And it often explains the way people are, the way they come across, like Nancy in the novel. You had no idea why she was the way she was until you understood what had happened to her in the past. And I think so often we make judgments about people without necessarily, taking the time to understand why people are the way that they are.
I didn't know that about Nancy myself when I started.
I love that. That's so cool. Okay, so there is a darker thread in this novel as well, a thread about the things people or women in particular tell themselves to explain away unacceptable behaviour from their partners despite all warning signs. Vera certainly ignores or overlooks her husband's behaviour in the lead up to their marriage so many years earlier. And she does this to her own detriment, I think. And Maddie as well, she seems to be so desperate to find love that she makes excuses for men who treat her badly. Do you think that this says something about women in general and our desire not to make waves or to hurt people's feelings?
I do. I think Vera's upbringing probably helped her to be more stoic about anything that happened. She had a grandmother who lost a husband and a son. I can't remember exactly which war it was in. One was World War I and one was World War II, I think, and had sort of told Vera, that accepting what the Lord, it's God's way and all that sort of thing. I do think I tried to make Vera not too easily. Tried to give her some strength, though, in that she was told just before she was married, it was hinted at that her husband was about to lose his farm, but it was on her very wedding day, and everything was in flow, and it was really hard to stop. But she did stop the proceedings while she at least questioned her husband about it. But he was such a charmer and so good at hiding his own weaknesses that he managed to convince her everything was okay. So I did try to make her at least investigate as much as she could under the circumstances, I thought. I'm aware that Maddie was not as strong as Vera in some ways, but she's a lot younger, of course. But I was also intrigued by the whole idea of how girls can, or young women, or women of any age, can be conned by guys on Tinder. Not that I've explored that area myself.
Neither have I.
But for me, it was more of a fun thing to play with. And I liked the idea of the reader being able to see that she was being foolish and wishing that she, without, I hope, getting too cranky with her.
I think of women like Vera who have spent the best part of their lives being wives and mothers and who suddenly find themselves alone. And I often joke to my family that I've never had a room of my own since I shared a room with my sister until the day I got married, and ever since I've shared a room with my husband. But if I suddenly found myself completely alone, I wonder how I would cope. So is this something you wanted to address or explore in this story as well?
I certainly wanted the sense of disconnection and of relocation and not settling happily into the new place and missing her home. Yeah, the loneliness was there, although Vera had coped with a few different problems in her life. So I don't think loneliness was so much a problem as just an unwillingness to really settle into the new place. She knew she should join a book club and go to the gym or, do a few things like that where she would meet people, but she was being a bit stubborn about that. Yeah.
Indeed. Community gardening is certainly something that we've seen more and more of in metropolitan areas. Nature strip veggie patches along with garden beehives to ensure plants continue to be pollinated. So I wondered, did you do any research to bring this rooftop garden or the rooftop garden scenes alive for this book?
We did actually join a community garden when we first moved back down here to Townsville. It's on a riverbank in one of the suburbs, and everyone has their own plot and grow vegetables and all that sort of thing. But then when COVID came and it was such an ordeal with all the hand washing and getting through the padlocks and, all the issues, we sort of, I'm afraid we didn't stick with it, but that was certainly an interesting experience and an insight into how they work. I also spent a lot of time, too much time, trawling the internet, looking at beautiful videos and and articles about rooftop gardens, because they are a thing. They're a growing phenomenon all over the world now. You know, cities like London and New York and in Europe have some amazing rooftop gardens. So, yeah, I spent a lot of time looking at those and reading articles and just generally sinking into that kind of thinking. Yeah.
Barbara, the last time that we chatted on the podcast, you were kind enough to offer some tips for aspiring writers. So I wondered this time if you might share some insight into your own writing process. For example, how long does it take you to write a first draft?
I'm a slow writer. I'm a fiddler, and I keep fixing and working on my work, so that I would love to be able to write a dirty first draft that I hear other people able to do, you know, go really quickly and then come back and fix it. But I've been writing for 20 years now, so I know what my process is. And for me, it's slow, plod, fix, another step forward kind of thing. And if I realize I've made a mistake, I go back and fix it. I don't wait till I've finished. And, you know, for example, when I wrote The Secret Years quite a few years ago now, hard to believe, we went overseas in the middle of it. I got to about, 70 or 80,000, and then we went overseas. And I had one character, an old man, that I killed off at the beginning of the book. You know, it was his death that brought his granddaughter home. But while I was away, I realised that I wanted him to have a reconciliation with his daughter. And so, of course, I had to resurrect him. So a lot of writers would just come home, finish the story the way they wanted it, and then go back and fix. But I had to go back and rewrite the first part before I went on. But something I've discovered this year about my writing process, I thought I wanted to write about a photographer for the book I'm working on now. I did a little photography course at the end of last year that involved going over to Magnetic Island on a Saturday afternoon, and it was great fun and I really enjoyed it. And got right into this whole idea of photography. I went and interviewed some professional photographers here in town and made lots of notes. Nothing was coming. And I realised I never work from the character and then find the story. I always have to have an emotional situation, and then I work from that. So I until I know what the emotional core of my story is, I can't keep going. So yeah, I worked out what the emotional setup was, and then found the characters and the setting, and a photographer didn't feature in there anywhere. The message there is finding what works for you, and don't let anyone tell you there's only one way to write, because, you know, we've all got our own path.
How many hours a day would you devote to writing when you're actively working on your book?
It just depends on how it's flowing. I work more on trying to write 1,000 words a day. Mm-hmm. Some days I get up early before it's even sunrise, and they're down before breakfast.
Wow.
But that's a very rare day. Other days I'm still there trying to get it when my husband's putting dinner on for me. What I love about writing is that you can be flexible, and if the family's got an event on, you can go to it, and I can go and watch my grandchildren do sport or whatever. But I still write pretty much 7 days a week.
To hear you say that there are days that it takes you much longer to write your 1,000 words than other days, you know, it just kind of puts it all into perspective for those of us who do sit down at the desk and find that the words are not flowing. I find it excruciating sometimes to write a paragraph. And then other days it's like you can't stop the flow. It's quite incredible. So it's always really fascinating for me to hear from seasoned writers like yourself that this is a common problem.
Yep.
Is there anything about your process that you would say has changed in the years since you've become a published author?
Well, when I first started writing, I was writing for Mills and Boon, which was category romance, and they were only 50,000 words, and the whole focus was just on the hero and the heroine, really. And if you had any extra characters, you often got into trouble and had to pare them down and all that sort of thing. That's not process, though, is it? But I have certainly widened my horizons to include historical research and different things like that. Process is probably very similar. When I was writing a lot of outback books, I used to, and before we were using the internet as much as we do now, I was collecting pictures from magazines and making collages that I had up on a pin board near my desk as a sort of a mood board or a scene, you know, just to help, so that when I came back to my desk, it was there. I still do that sometimes, not for every book, but I tend now to make it a screensaver collage rather than a a paper one. If I'm having a slow day, I often find listening to music helps me.
Mm-hmm.
Just helps me to be more disciplined and to stop thinking about all the other things that I might distract myself with. I've discovered ABC Classic FM2, which has no words, just music, and it's there's nothing really modern or uncomfortable listening in it. It's just, and half the time you end up not listening to it at all, but it's that background sort of hum. Again, originally I used to make myself soundtracks, and I think my process has stayed pretty similar, really.
Yeah, fantastic. I love that. So I wanted to chat a little bit about the cover of this beautiful book. It signals a departure from the style of your previous books, and I wondered if that was deliberate.
Well, it's deliberate on the part of my publishers, yeah. It was their idea. I think they wanted to... I have a fairly solid fan base of older readers, and I think they were trying to reach perhaps more younger readers with this story or with that look. I love it.
I do too. I think it's really fresh.
It was designed by a girl in her 20s, which is fun. One of the plants on the cover is her attempt at a pink philodendron. It's not quite.
Yes, I see it now.
Right, but yeah.
yeah, fantastic. Barb, you mentioned you were working on something else at the moment. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I'm a little bit superstitious about saying too much about what I'm working on when I'm still in the middle, but again, it's about people that connect in different ways, but it's in a totally different setting. That I have a 14-year-old girl in this story, and I don't very often write about teenagers. It's certainly not as central characters, but I have got one in this story. And I called her Delta to start with.
Oh.
Can you believe? A couple of months back, I realised that name needed to be ditched. So I've got a 14-year-old granddaughter, and her best friend's Raven, and I was looking for something unusual. So I went with Raven for a while, but a couple of days ago, I said to my husband, Raven's not working for me. So she's been renamed. Yeah, but that's been fun, having a teenager in a central role. I guess, rather than process, the direction of my stories has been the thing that's changed more over the time. Rather than just romance, I now look at different kinds of relationships between generations and friends and that sort of thing.
Barbara, if listeners wanted to connect with you or to learn more about your books, where can they find you?
Well, I'm on Facebook. I have a website, just barbarahannay.com, and I love hearing from readers. I have an Instagram account, but it's bit on and off again, I'm afraid. Yeah, and there is a blog connected to my website, but it's mainly on Facebook that I connect with readers.
Barbara, I thoroughly enjoyed reading The Garden of Hopes and Dreams. No doubt it will be lapped up by your fans around the world. Thank you for another gorgeous read and for chatting with me today on Talking Aussie Books.
Thank you for talking. I really appreciate the wonderful work you do for all us Aussie authors. It's amazing. Thank you.
Well, that's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes or drop me a line via my Instagram at Claudine Tinellis or on my webpage, claudinetинellis.com. Thanks for listening. Until next time, happy reading.